When we last sat together by this fire, I left a young woman alone in the dark, with a terrible piece of paper in her hands, and I have a notion you have been thinking of her ever since. I have, you will remember her, Lady Eleanor Beaumont, clever, dowerless, brave past all sense, sitting at her dead father's writing desk by the light of one guttering candle, reading the words her father had written, and folded, and hidden, and never sent. You will remember what those words said. That the ruin of the House of Beaumont had not been the simple bad luck of a weak man at the card tables. That a smiling friend had sat at her father's elbow through all of it, year upon year, guiding him with great patience toward the edge of a cliff. And you will remember the line that broke off unfinished, the line that Ellie read 4 times and 5 in the silence of that sleeping house. I begin to believe I was never an unlucky man at all. I begin to believe I was a hunted one, and that the hunt is not even now concluded. Not concluded. A widow, 2 daughters, a name, and a smiling, patient man already at work upon the eldest of those daughters, courting her, surrounding her, drawing a cage up around her, week by careful week. Ellie did not sleep that night. She sat with the letter until the candle drowned in its own wax, and somewhere in those dark hours she made herself a promise, quiet and grim and entirely unladylike, that she would learn the truth of what had been done to her father if it took her the rest of her life. She did not yet know the smiling man's name. She had her suspicions. You have shared them. But a suspicion is not a proof. And Lady Eleanor Beaumont had been raised by a gentle, careful man to know the difference. So she folded the letter very small, and she sewed it. And I want you to remember that she did this, for it matters later. She sewed it into the lining of her travelling case, against her heart, where her father's words could go everywhere she went. And then, into that grieving, resolute, frightened household, 4 mornings later there came an invitation. It was not a letter, it was a card. And I give it the capital letter the Beaumont parlour gave it, because a thing of that weight deserves one, thick as a shingle, edged in gilt, and engraved with a crest that every soul in England would have known at a glance. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenswood requested the honour of the company of the Viscountess Beaumont, and of Lady Eleanor, and of Lady Margaret Beaumont, at Ravenswood Park, for the 6 weeks of high summer. I wish you could have seen the narrow parlour receive it. Margaret shrieked. There is no more dignified word. And Margaret would not thank me for inventing one. She shrieked, and seized the card, and read it aloud 3 times, and spun about the room with it pressed to her bosom already in her bright, untroubled mind, halfway up the great staircase of Ravenswood in a gown she did not yet own. The Viscountess wept. She wept the slow, leaking, overwhelmed tears of a tired woman, to whom hope has become a more frightening visitor than despair. And she held the card in both thin hands, and whispered that they were saved, that surely now they were saved, and looked at Ellie with that terrible rising light in her eyes. And Ellie stood apart by the careful little fire, and felt the whole tangled weight of it settle onto her at once. For she understood the invitation better than her mother or her sister could. She understood, first, that it could not be refused. One does not decline a duchess. To decline would be an insult that the House of Beaumont, hanging by its last frayed thread of consequence, could not afford to give. She understood, second, why it had truly come. The Duke of Ravenswood had insulted her pride in a shabby parlour and been sent away with his ears ringing. The Duke of Ravenswood would never, of his own motion, have asked the Beaumonts under his roof after that. This was the Dowager's doing. This was the formidable old woman with the silver-headed cane, reaching down from her great height to set a clever penniless girl directly in her grandson's path. And Ellie did not yet know whether that reaching hand meant to lift her or to test her, and the not knowing was its own cold weight. And she understood, third, and this was the weight that bent her, that to go to Ravenswood was to walk straight back into the orbit of the man whose offer of money she had thrown in his face, and whom she had not, in all the long, careful nights since, managed to stop thinking about. Not for an hour. The grey eyes, the dry voice in the dark, the way he had not argued. You should not be hurried, Lady Eleanor. She had told herself a great many sensible things in the weeks between, and not one of them had worked. But there was a fourth thing, and it was the thing that finally decided her, and it had nothing to do with the Duke at all. A house party at Ravenswood Park, at the height of the season's overflow into the country, would gather the cream of the ton under one roof for 6 weeks. And the cream of the ton, Ellie knew with a cold and sudden clarity, would include, must include, for he went everywhere the Beaumonts went, that being the entire architecture of his courtship, Viscount Harrington, 6 weeks under one roof with the smiling man, 6 weeks of proximity, of watching, of overheard words and unguarded moments, of the chance, the only chance she was ever likely to be handed, to study her enemy from close enough to learn what he was. Her father had been hunted. Ellie folded her hands and lifted her chin and looked into the careful little fire and decided that she would go to Ravenswood, and that this time the hunt would have 2 directions. We accept, she said. Of course we accept. Margaret, do stop spinning, you will be sick. There is a great deal to be done. There was. There were gowns to be contrived out of almost nothing, and the Viscountess's strength to be hoarded for the journey, and Charlotte Langley. And here Ellie did the one purely selfish thing she allowed herself in the whole business. Charlotte Langley to be got included, for Ellie wrote that very day a careful note to the Dowager, all proper gratitude, mentioning only in the most modest passing that her dear friend Miss Langley of the Hampshire Langleys had been her companion since the schoolroom. And the Dowager Duchess, who missed nothing and forgot nothing, and knew exactly who the Hampshire Langleys were, sent back a single line in a hand like black lace. Bring your Miss Langley. A clever girl should never go into deep water without one friend who can swim. Ellie read that line several times. She could not decide whether it was a kindness or a warning. In time she would learn that, with the Dowager Duchess of Ravenswood, it was very rarely necessary to choose, for the old woman had a great gift for making a thing be both at once. And so, on a bright morning in the first week of summer, a hired carriage carried the 3 women of the House of Beaumont and the watchful Miss Langley out of London and into the green country, toward a great house none of them had seen, and a tangle of secrets that 3 of them did not know was waiting, and that the 4th, Ellie, with her father's letter sewn against her heart, was riding directly toward with her eyes wide open. You came up the drive at Ravenswood through a mile of ancient oaks, and then the trees fell away all at once, and there it was. I have shown you one great house already in this tale, Richmond House, blazing in the London night. But Ravenswood Park was a different order of thing entirely, and I must take a moment over it, because a house in this story is never only a house. Richmond House had been built to be looked at. Ravenswood had been built to last. It was old, and it was honey and grey, and it spread along its low green hill with the deep, unhurried confidence of a family that had not had to think about its own survival in 300 years. Long windows, soft-worn stone, a lake below the south front lying still as a held breath, and everywhere about it. This was the thing that caught at Ellie's chest as the carriage drew up, the thing she had not expected. Everywhere about the house, climbing its walls, crowding its borders, spilling over its low balustrades in great drifts of white and crimson, and the particular deep pink of an old summer dusk. There were roses, roses without number, roses gone half wild with abundance. The whole of Ravenswood Park, in that first week of high summer, was drowning gently and gloriously in roses, and the scent of them came in at the carriage window like something you could lie down in, and Margaret gasped. And even Charlotte was silent, and Ellie sat very still and felt, against all her armour, her eyes sting. She did not yet know the story of those roses. She would learn it before the summer was out, and so will you. And it is not, I will tell you now, a happy one. But on that first bright morning, the roses of Ravenswood were simply beautiful, and the house was simply grand, and the great door was already open. And on the steps, straight-backed, leaning upon a silver-headed cane that she plainly did not need, stood the Dowager Duchess. "So," said the Dowager, when the curtsies had been made and the names performed, and her sharp, pale grey eyes. Alexander's eyes, Ellie thought with a small jolt. The boy had got his grandmother's. Eyes had finished moving over the four arrivals with the swift completeness of a woman pricing a market stall. "So, you are the Beaumont girls." Her gaze settled on Ellie and stayed there, frank and unembarrassed. "And you are the one who refused my grandson's money and sent him home looking, for the first time in some years, as though a thought had struck him. I have wanted to look at you. You are not in the least what I expected, which I find I am too old to consider anything but a recommendation. Come in out of the sun." It was, Ellie understood, going to be a long 6 weeks. The company of a great house party assembles the way a chessboard fills before a game. And over that first day and evening, Ellie watched the pieces take their squares. There were perhaps 24 guests in all. The brilliant, the well-bred, the merely fashionable, a bishop, a poetess, a pair of marriageable girls deployed by their mother with frank military purpose. But Ellie, with her father's letter against her heart and her promise grim and quiet inside her, did not waste her watching on the bishop. She watched for the pieces that mattered. She found the first of them in the long drawing-room before dinner, a fair, easy, laughing gentleman of about 30, sandy-haired and amber-eyed, who lounged against the chimney-piece with a glass of the Duke's wine and a look of perfect good humour, and who was introduced to her as Lord Sebastian Vale. He was charming. He was charming the way some men are tall, without effort, without seeming to know he was doing it. And within 3 minutes he had made Margaret laugh twice and blush once. And Ellie, watching her, sister's bright face turned toward that lazy warmth like a flower toward noon, thought, "Ah, there is something beginning." She was right. She was watching the first hour of a thing that would run through the rest of this story. For Margaret Beaumont had just, in a drawing-room full of roses, met the man she was going to love. But Ellie also saw, because Ellie always saw the second thing, that Lord Sebastian's laughing amber eyes went still, now and again, when he thought no one was looking, that the charm was real but was also, somehow, a door, and that behind it there was room she had not been shown, a charming rake with something locked away. She filed it. She filed everything that summer. She found the second piece, the one she had truly come to study, by the windows, and Viscount Harrington had clearly been waiting for her to be free, for he crossed the room the moment Lord Sebastian released her, smooth and unhurried, the midnight coat exchanged for country dark green, but the man inside it unchanged. "Lady Eleanor, the bow, the flawless bow. I confess I was uneasy when I heard you were to be at Ravenswood. The Dowager is a formidable hostess, and the Duke—" And here something moved, very briefly, behind Harrington's pale eyes. Something Ellie caught and held and turned over for a long time afterward. "The Duke is not, shall we say, an easy man. I shall consider it my particular duty this summer to see that you are not made uncomfortable. You have only to come to me." He smiled. "We desperate cases must look after one another. We desperate cases." He had said it lightly, charmingly, as a little joke between friends. But Ellie heard the iron under it, heard him remind her, in 6 pleasant words, that he knew exactly how little stood between her family and the abyss, and that he counted that knowledge as a thing he owned, the cage, a new bar of the cage, set in place with a smile, in the first hour, in front of the roses. "How kind," said Ellie, and smiled back, and gave him nothing, and felt the cold thread pull tight. And the third piece, the one her treacherous heart had been counting the hours toward, however, sternly, she had forbidden it. The third piece she did not find at all that first day. The Duke of Ravenswood did not appear at dinner. He sent his apologies by way of his grandmother. Estate business. A matter with a tenant farm. And the Dowager delivered them with a bland smoothness that did not deceive Ellie for a moment. The Duke of Ravenswood was hiding, somewhere in his own enormous house. The man who had been routed in a shabby parlour was avoiding the woman who had routed him. And Ellie, lying awake that first night in a grand cool bedroom with roses nodding at the open window, found that she was, and she was thoroughly ashamed of it, smiling into the dark. He could not hide forever. It was his house. And Ellie Beaumont had not come to Ravenswood to be hidden from. She found him in the library on the third morning, and neither of them had planned it. And that, by now you know this story's habits, is precisely why it mattered. Ellie had risen early, the house still asleep around her, and gone looking for the library because a library was the room she trusted most in any house. And the library at Ravenswood, when she eased, open its tall door, stopped her where she stood. It ran the whole depth of the south front, 2 floors of books, a gallery with an iron stair, long windows pouring the early gold across a floor, the colour of dark honey. And the smell of it, leather and dust and old paper, the smell of every safe hour Ellie had ever stolen for herself. She stood in the doorway and simply breathed it. "It is the one room in the house," said a voice from the gallery above her, dry and quiet and entirely familiar, "that I have never once wished to set fire to. You may come in, Lady Eleanor. I find I have run out of corridors to avoid you in, and a man cannot decently hide in his own library when a guest is standing in the door of it, looking as though she has come home." Ellie looked up. The Duke of Ravenswood stood at the gallery rail with a book in his hand, and the early light hard along the scar on his jaw. And he was looking down at her with an expression that was trying very seriously to be cool and was not quite managing it. "Your Grace has been avoiding me," said Ellie. "My grandmother filled my house with 24 people in order to place one of them in my path. I considered it only sporting to make her work for it." He came down the iron stair, unhurried. "You are angry with me still. You have every right to be. I have spent 3 days composing the apology I owe you and discarding each version as worse than the last. And I have arrived at the conclusion that there is no graceful way to say I was a fool, and so I shall simply say it without grace. I was a fool. In your parlour, I knew it before I reached the street." "Yes," Ellie agreed. "You were." And then, because she was honest, and because the gold light was very kind, and because 3 days of being hidden from had worn her resolve thinner than she liked to admit. "But you did not argue. When I told you what you had done, you might have argued. Most men would have explained to me at length how my pride was a luxury I could not afford, and you did not. You bowed your head and you took it. I have thought about that more than I have thought about the insult, if you want the truth. It is a rare man who can be told he is wrong and simply hear it." The Duke of Ravenswood was silent a moment. "The war taught me that," he said at last. "It is nearly the only useful thing it taught me. On a battlefield, the man who cannot bear to be told he is wrong gets other men killed. I have seen it done." He set his book down on the long table between them. "I had thought I left that lesson on the continent, with everything else. It seems a little of it followed me home. And that was the beginning of it, the true beginning, the thing the dark garden and the stone bench had only promised. They talked. They talked in the Ravenswood library that morning until the breakfast gong went unheard, and then they talked there again the next morning, and the next, until it became, without either of them ever proposing it, the settled secret habit of both their days. And what they found, in those early golden hours among the books, was the rarest thing either of them had ever been handed. A mind that answered their own. For Ellie, at last, and to her own astonishment, stopped hiding her cleverness. She had spent 3 years folding it small, because the world punished a woman for it. And here was a man who, when she let slip a sharp thing, did not blink, and did not frown, and did not perform that particular pained male smile, but simply sharpened and answered and gave it back to her honed. She told him, one morning, almost without deciding too, about the French poetry, about the notebook, about the slow loving work of carrying a line from one language into another without breaking it, and she braced, out of pure habit, for the indulgent look. It did not come. Instead, the Duke of Ravenswood asked her which poets, and argued with her choice, and then asked, diffidently, which she had not known he could be, whether she might one day let him read a page of the notebook, because he had always found, he said, that you could not truly know a person until you had seen the thing they did when no one required them to do anything at all, and in return he gave her the inside of his own guarded mind. And she found it was not cold there at all. It was tired, and it was scarred, and it was deeply, bleakly funny, and it had thought hard and without comfort about the world. He was a cynic. He told her so plainly. He had gone to the war believing certain things about honor and his country and the goodness at the bottom of men. And he had watched all of it burn, and he had come home believing that society was a polished machine for the protection of the comfortable, that the ton was a court of liars rewarding each other for lying well, and that kindness was, in the main, simply cruelty that had not yet been put to the test. And you? Ellie said. They were in the window embrasure. The rain, for it had clouded over, was beginning against the long glass. You believe that, and you are still here, still a duke, still going down to dinner, still letting your grandmother parade marriageable girls past you. If the machine is as rotten as you say, why do you keep oiling it? Because I do not know how to be anything else. That, said Ellie, is the laziest thing I have ever heard a clever man say. He turned and looked at her. You sit there, Ellie went on, and she did not soften it, because she had stopped, somewhere in those golden mornings, being able to be anything with him but entirely herself. And you tell me the world is a machine for protecting the comfortable, and you say it as though that excuses you from it. As though, the thing being rotten, your only choices are to oil it or to walk away into the dark and brood, which is your great talent. But there is a third thing, Your Grace, and you know there is. And your cynicism is the wall you have built, so that you need never go and do it. You have land, and a name that silences a room, and more power in your Morning Post than my family has had in its whole history. If the machine grinds the weak, then a man with your hands on it might grind a little less hard. You call the world rotten, and you use the rottenness as a reason to do nothing. I have no money, no name, no power, and a sick mother and a debt I did not make, and I get up every morning and I do the next thing, and the next, because there is no one else to do it. Do not tell me about the machine. I am underneath it. You are merely standing on top of it, being sad. The library was very quiet. The rain ran down the glass, and the Duke of Ravenswood looked at Lady Eleanor Beaumont for a long, long moment. Looked at her freckles, and her unbroken hazel eyes, and her chin that would not come down. And something happened in his grave, scarred face that Ellie had not seen there before, something that was not the dry, near law, and was not the cold mask, but was older than both, and far more dangerous to them both. My grandmother, he said quietly, told me, after your visit to the parlour, that a thought had struck me. She was wrong. It was not a thought. It was you. It has been you, since a dark garden and a glass of lemonade I was unequal to providing, and I have spent every day since attempting, with the full resources of a duke, to be unmoved, and I find this morning that I have entirely failed, and that I do not, any longer, very much wish to succeed." He drew a breath. "You should know that, whatever else this summer does to us. And it will do something, I think. I can feel it gathering, the way you can feel that rain. You should know that I have been told the truth by the cleverest woman in England in my own library, and that I would not give the memory back for the kingdom." It was not a declaration. It was too dangerous for both of them to be a declaration. The walls I told you of in our first evening were all still standing, everyone. But it was the truth, said aloud, by a man who did not say the truth aloud. And Ellie sat in the window embrasure with the rain at her back, and her heart going like a struck drum, and could not, for once in her clever life, find a single word to give him back, so she gave him none. She rose, instead, a little unsteadily, and she said something about the breakfast gong, and she went out of the library with her cheeks warm and her mind in a glorious and terrifying disorder. And, behind her, the Duke of Ravenswood stood among his books and watched the door close, and did not, for a long while, move at all. That was how the rhythm of the summer set itself, and for a few golden weeks it was, I will tell you plainly, as near to happiness as Ellie Beaumont had come, since the floor of her life turned out to be a card table. The mornings were the library. They never spoke of it, never arranged it. It simply became true that if Ellie came down early, she would find the Duke already there, and that they would talk until the gong, and that the talk would be the best hour of her day. But the long afternoons belonged to the whole company, and Ellie found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind the company, because the company gave her a thing the library could not. It let her watch Alexander move through his own world and learn him by it. There were the walks. The Dowager believed in walks the way a general believes in drill. Every fine afternoon, the guests were marched out across the park, down to the lake, through the wilderness, along the famous road, gardens. And on those walks, the careful etiquette of the procession had a way of dissolving, so that a pair might find themselves 20 yards adrift of the rest, with no one able to say quite how. Ellie and Alexander became, over those weeks, very skilled at being 20 yards adrift. They argued, mostly. They argued about books, and about whether the French were a frivolous people or merely a more honest one, and about whether a man owed more to his name or to his conscience when the two of them quarrelled. And Ellie noticed that the Duke of Ravenswood, who had told her the world was at an rotten machine, listened to her arguments about it with the particular hunger of a man who very much wanted to be talked out of his own despair and had simply never before met anyone equal to the task. And there were the evenings of music. Ravenswood held a musicale twice a week in the long drawing-room, and here it was Margaret who came into her glory. Margaret had a true, sweet voice and not one particle of shyness, and she would stand by the pianoforte and sing the sentimental airs of the day with her whole bright heart, while Lord Sebastian Vale, with an attentiveness that the whole room had begun to remark, turned the pages of her music. Ellie watched that page-turning. She watched at her sister's face tip up, glowing, toward the lazy amber-eyed charm of him, and she watched Sebastian. And here was the thing she filed away. She watched Sebastian look at Margaret, in an unguarded moment between songs, with an expression that was not a rake's at all, but was startled and tender and faintly afraid. The look of a man who has gone fishing for an afternoon's amusement and felt something far larger than he intended take the line. It was at one of those musicales that Ellie was made to play. She had tried to escape it. The Dowager did not permit escape, so Ellie sat down at the great instrument with her heart in her throat, and she did not play the English air the room expected. She played instead a French piece, old and spare and sad, and she played it the way she translated her poetry, slowly, with love, holding each engine until it had given up everything it had. The drawing room went quiet in a way. The drawing room did not usually trouble to go quiet. And when she lifted her hands from the keys at the last, she looked up, without meaning to, straight across the room, and met the grey eyes of the Duke of Ravenswood, who had not moved, and who was looking at her as though she were the only lit candle in a dark house. But I would be telling you the summer falsely if I gave you only its gold, for there was a shadow laid through it even then. And Ellie walked into the edge of it one wet afternoon when a walk was rained off, and she went exploring the long gallery alone. The gallery at Ravenswood was hung with 3 centuries of the family's dead, rank on rank of grave-painted faces. And near the end of it, Ellie came upon a portrait that stopped her. It showed 2 boys. The elder, perhaps 14, dark-haired and unsmiling, his hand on a globe, already wearing the gravity of the air like a coat cut too large. That was Alexander, unmistakably. The boy inside the man, and beside him, younger, fair where his brother was dark, caught by the painter in the act of laughing at something beyond the frame, with a single white rose held carelessly in one hand, was a boy Ellie had never heard named. "My grandsons," said the Dowager Duchess. Ellie had not heard her come. The old woman stood leaning on her cane, and she was not looking at Ellie. She was looking up at the laughing, fair-haired boy, and her sharp face had gone, for once, entirely undefended. "That is Frederick," said the Dowager. "The younger. He had the whole of the warmth of this family in him. All of it, I sometimes think, as though it had been portioned out and given both shares. He loved those roses. He built the glass house for them, did you know, with his own money, when he was 16. She was silent a moment. "He went to the war with his brother. He did not come back from it. We do not." And here the great Dowager Duchess of Ravenswood, who feared nothing, stopped, and Ellie saw her gather herself. "We do not speak of it much in this house. Alexander cannot. So you will oblige me, child, by not having seen me stand here. Come away. The light is going." Ellie came away. But she carried the laughing boy with the white rose out of that gallery with her, and a cold, soft question with him. For there had been something in the dowager's grief that was not quite the clean shape of grief, something held back, a door not entirely shut, and Ellie Beaumont, who filed everything that summer, filed that too. The long golden weeks drew on, and then, on a bright and treacherous morning in the high heart of the summer, the Dowager Duchess arranged a riding party for the afternoon. The weather having faithfully promised to clear, and sent particular word that she desired Lady Eleanor to join it, the weather did not clear. I think you have already guessed that the weather did not clear, and it is here that this tale stops being only words. I must tell you, before the horse bolts, that Ellie Beaumont was not a horsewoman. She had ridden as a child, gently, on gentle ponies, in the lost years before the fall. But a family that is counting candles does not keep saddle horses, and 3 years had passed. And when the Dowager's riding party assembled on the gravel that afternoon, Ellie looked at the tall, glossy mare led out for her with a private sinking of the heart and a public, composed smile. She would not say she could not. To say she could not was to be the poor relation, the charity case, the girl who had nothing and could do nothing. And Ellie Beaumont would have ridden a lion bareback before she let that be said of her at Ravenswood. So she let herself be put up, and she gathered the reins as her hands half remembered. And she told herself the mare was gentle, which was true, and that the sky would hold, which was not. They rode out a dozen strong across the great park. Margaret radiant beside Lord Sebastian, Charlotte watchful, Harrington smooth and attentive, and never far from Ellie's bridle, the Duke grave and silent at the head of them all. And for a while it was even pleasant, the roses, the lake, the green going on and on. But the clouds that had wept against the library glass had only been gathering their strength, and they had been gathering it, all that bright, deceitful morning, into something that meant the country. Hum. It came fast, the way summer storms come. The light went strange and brassy. The wind turned cold and got into the trees. And then the first thunder broke directly overhead. Not a distant grumble, but a vast splitting crack, as though the sky itself were a sheet of slate snapped over a knee. And at the very same instant, a covey of partridge burst up out of the hedgerow under the mare's nose in a clattering panic of wings. The gentle mare went mad. It is a terrible thing, and a fast thing, and Ellie had no horsewoman's instinct to meet it with. The mare screamed and bolted, flat out, blind, away from the thunder and the wings and the party, away across the open park toward the dark line of the woods. And Ellie was simply a passenger on a runaway animal, hauling at reins that meant nothing, her hat gone, her hair coming down, the ground a sickening green blur, and the rain now lashing down in earnest, and the woods coming at her far, far too fast. She did not scream. She told me long afterward. For I have had this story, you understand, from very near its source, that she did not scream because she was using all the breath she had to stay alive, and that the single clear thought in her head as the trees rushed toward her was not for herself at all. It was, who will look after Mama? And then there were hooves beside her. Hard, fast, even, a great black hunter ridden by a man who rode it, as though the two of them were one creature. And the Duke of Ravenswood drew alongside the bolting mare, and leaned, and got a gloved hand to the rein close by the bit, and did not haul and did not jerk, but simply asked the maddened animal, with the whole weight and skill and unhurried iron of him, to come back. And the mare came back. He brought them down, from the killing gallop to a canter, to a high broken trot, to a plunging, blowing, trembling halt at the very edge of the dripping woods. And before the mare had finished, the Duke was off his own horse and had his hands up to Ellie, and she came down into them because her own legs had stopped being things she could rely upon. And for a moment, in the hammering rain, the Duke of Ravenswood simply held Lady Eleanor Beaumont hard against him, and neither of them said anything at all. "You are not hurt." His voice was rougher than she had ever heard it. It was not a question. It was a man checking, with his hands at her shoulders, at arm's length now, his grey eyes going over her white face. "You are not hurt. Say it. I am not hurt." Her teeth had begun to chatter. The rain was sheeting down. They were both of them already soaked through. The rest of the party was a scatter of distant specks, half a mile back across the park. "I am, Your Grace, I am extremely wet, and I have just discovered that I am a great deal more frightened than I was prepared to be, and I would be very grateful if you did not let go of me for one more moment, and I will deny having asked it for the rest of my life." He did not let go. He got an arm about her and walked her, both horses' reins in his other fist, in under the heavy shelter of the wood's edge, where a vast old cedar held off the worst of the rain in a wide, dim, dripping room of its own. And there, and this is the moment the whole of Ravenswood turns upon. There the Duke of Ravenswood stripped off his own greatcoat, sodden though it was on the outside and warm, yet within, and he wrapped it around Lady Eleanor Beaumont, and as he drew its heavy collar close about her throat, his hands stilled. They stilled, and they stayed, his hands at the collar of the coat, against the cold skin of her neck, and her own hands, without her permission, having come up to rest flat against his chest. And the two of them stood in the green stormlight under the cedar, soaked and breathing, and entirely alone, and for a long moment that had no business being as long as what was, neither of them moved, and neither of them looked away. "You came after me," Ellie said. Her voice was not steady. "Across the whole park. You did not even pause." "No. You might have broken your neck." "Yes," said the Duke of Ravenswood, perfectly simply. "I had thought of that, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not appear to care. His hands were still at her collar. The rain roared on the cedar above them. I have spent 4 years, Eleanor, being very careful never to have anything I could not afford to lose. It was restful. I recommend it to anyone. And then a young woman walked into me in a garden and was rude to me. And I find my whole careful arrangement is in ruins. Because half an hour ago I watched a horse run away with you toward a wood, and I learned in that half-minute that there is now, once again, something in the world I cannot afford to lose, and that there is not the smallest thing I can do about it. Ellie looked up at him, the scar pale in the dim green light, the grey eyes that the world called cold, and that were not, that had never been, that were at this moment about as far from cold as a thing can be. "You are shivering," he said low. "So are you." "Yes," said the Duke, and neither of them, you will notice, had yet stepped back. They might have. I will not tell you what they might have done under that cedar in the roaring rain, because they did not do it. The world came back for them first, in the shape of half the riding, party crashing wet and anxious through the trees, Charlotte's voice calling Ellie's name, Harrington's pale eyes finding the two soaked figures standing close, far too close, in the green dark, and going for one unguarded instant before the smile slid back over them, absolutely flat with calculation. But you must hold that moment under the cedar in your heart, exactly as Ellie held it, all through the cold and difficult things that are coming. Because it was real. Whatever the world was about to do to them, that was real. The coat, the stilled hands, the man who did not pause. And in stories such as this one, the real moments are the coin you spend, much later to buy the ending. A great house has two lives. There is the life above stairs, of roses and candlelight and careful conversation. And there is the other life, the one that runs through the back passages and the kitchen and the servants' hall. And it is in that second life that a great house keeps its honest opinion of the first. Ellie Beaumont, who had spent 3 years on the difficult border between the two, knew this better than any pampered guest at Ravenswood. And it was her knowing it that wounded her. It was the morning after the storm. Ellie had slept poorly. The cedar, the hands, the grey eyes would not let her sleep well. And she had risen early and gone down by a back stair, meaning to beg a cup of chocolate from the kitchen, before the house woke, the way she might have done in her own home. She came along the stone passage quietly, in her soft slippers, and the two housemaids polishing the brass in the little anteroom did not hear her. And they were, in the way of housemaids everywhere, discussing the quality. Rode the whole park after her, Mary, in front of everyone, and brought her in wrapped in his own coat. His own coat. I had it off the hook to dry, and it was that wet through. Well, and there it is. The second voice was older, flatter, the voice of a woman who had been in service a long time and had stopped, expecting the world to be anything but what it was. There it is, and it can come to nothing, and the sooner that poor child sees it, the kinder. He'll not be let. You know he'll not be let. But if he's fond of her, fond. A short laugh, not unkind, which somehow made it worse, fond. Mary, he's a duke. It isn't a question of fond. Her Grace has been 3 years hunting this country for a bride for him, and do you know what she wants? She wants a girl without one word said of her. Not one. Spotless. Because of the war. Because of the things that have been said of His Grace since the war. The ugly things, you know the ones. I mean, I'll not repeat them in this house. A duke that's whispered of needs. A duchess that's whispered of never. That's the long and short of it. And that little Beaumont thing. Sweet as she is, and clever. I'll grant you, you can see she's clever. She's got a dead father drowned in debt, and not a shilling to her name, and now there's talk from that garden party in town, and there'll be fresh talk from this business with the coats by nightfall. She's the very last girl in England, Her Grace would allow. The family knows it. They want her sent off and settled before his grace makes a public fool of himself over a pretty pauper. Mark me, it can come to nothing, and it will come to nothing, and him riding through a storm only makes the ending harder. There was a small sound of brass being set down. It seems a shame, said the young maid Mary quietly. A great many things are a shame, said the older woman. Pass me the cloth. Ellie did not go in for her chocolate. She stood in the cold stone passage with her hand against the wall, and she let the two voices move away into the kitchen, and she stood there a good while longer after they had gone. Now, I want to be very honest with you here, the way I have promised to be, because it would be easy to tell this part wrongly. It would be easy to say that Ellie Beaumont was foolish, that she ought to have known better than to let two housemaids' gossip strike her so hard. But I do not think she was foolish, and I do not think you will, when you have understood it. Because the cruel thing about what Ellie overheard was not that it was spiteful. It was that it was true. Every word of it was true. She had a dead father drowned in debt. She had not a shilling. There was talk from the Thornbury garden, and there would be talk from the storm. She had known that the moment she saw Harrington's flat, pale eyes find her under the cedar, and the Dowager Duchess did want a spotless bride. Ellie had felt the truth of that in the old woman's frank appraising stare on the very first step of the house. The maid had not been gossiping. The maid had simply been saying, plainly, over the brass, the thing that the whole machinery of that world had already decided, and that only Ellie, in the warm, foolish glow of a cedar tree, had let herself briefly forget. It can come to nothing. It will come to nothing. And so Ellie did the thing that brave and clever people do when they are wounded in the one place their cleverness cannot defend. She did not weep, and she did not rage. She simply, quietly began to withdraw. She told herself it was sense. She told herself it was kindness even, kindness to him. For if she was the wrong bride, the dangerous bride, the bride who would pile her own cracked name onto whatever the war had already done to his, then to let him go on caring for her was not romance, it was harm. She told herself she was protecting the people she loved, which she was, and that a clever woman does not let herself be ruined twice over for the warmth of a coat in the rain. She believed all of it. That is what made it so hard to argue her out of. And over the days that followed, the Duke of Ravenswood, who had stood under a cedar and told her, as near as a careful man could come to it, that he loved her, watched the woman who had set his careful life in ruins go cool and even and perfectly polite. She did not come to the library in the mornings any more. When he sought her out, she was gracious and witty and entirely closed, and she would not let her eyes hold his for longer than courtesy required. She had taken the real thing from under the cedar and locked it away, exactly as he had once locked his own heart away, against a day that might be safe. And Alexander of Ravenswood, watching her do, it felt the old grey water begin quietly to rise. He did not know what he had done. That was the misery of it. He cast back over every word and could not find his error, because there had been no error. The thing that had changed Ellie was not anything he had done, but something the world had said behind a closed door, and you cannot mend a wound you have not been told exists. He grew in those days, very silent. The household, watching, decided the cold Duke had merely tired of his guest, and felt in its wisdom that this was for the best. Only the Dowager Duchess, who missed nothing, looked at the careful coolness between her grandson and the Beaumont girl, and frowned, and tapped her cane once upon the floor, and began, behind her sharp pale eyes, to wonder what, precisely, somebody had said, and to whom, and whether she would need to find them out and make them sorry. While Ellie's heart was quietly breaking itself in the name of good sense, her mind, and this is the saving grace of a woman built as Ellie was built, her mind did not stop working. She had come to Ravenswood with 2 hunts to pursue, and if the world had just slammed shut the door on the one she had not dared to name, Then she would put the whole of herself, all that fierce, locked-up feeling with nowhere now to go, into the other. She would find out the truth about the smiling man. And the smiling man, all that summer, was sleeping under the same roof. So Ellie watched Harrington, not as a courted woman watches a suitor. She was long past that, but as a hunter watches, patient and cold. And what she saw, once she was truly looking, began to frighten her. She noticed first that Harrington was never idle. The other guests drifted through the long summer days in a pleasant aimlessness. Harrington did not drift. Wherever 2 or 3 were gathered, he was somehow among them. Wherever a private word was passing, his shoulder was somehow near it. He gathered things. Ellie watched him gather them. A careless admission here, a family worry there, the small soft underbellies that people in their ease will show. And she watched him file each one away behind his pleasant face. And she thought of her father's letter, of the friend at the elbow, of the patient hunter, and the cold thread drew so tight she could scarcely breathe around it. And then, on a still evening in the 4th week, Ellie saw the smiling man with his mask off. It was after dinner. The company had spilled out onto the south terrace to take the cool air among the roses, and Ellie, slipping along the shadowed side of the house, to be for a moment alone with her thoughts, came near the open windows of the small library, the estate room, the lesser one, and heard, within, 2 voices. One was low and shaking. The other was Harrington's, and Harrington's voice, with no audience to be charming for, was a thing Ellie had never heard before, and never afterward forgot. It was pleasant still. That was the horror of it. It was perfectly pleasant and perfectly calm, and it was skinning a man alive. The shaking voice belonged to an elderly guest, a Sir John Crewe, a mild-stooped gentleman whom Ellie had marked already, without knowing why, as one of the unhappy pieces on the board, a man who flinched, and Harrington was reminding Sir John Crewe, in that calm, pleasant voice, of a certain note, a certain sum, a certain arrangement was the word he used, and Ellie heard Sir John Crewe's voice break on the answer, heard the old man say something about his daughter's good name, and heard Harrington, gently, so gently, agree that yes, it would be a great pity, a very great pity, if certain papers were to find their way into the wrong drawing-rooms, and that he was so very glad, so very glad, that he and Sir John understood one another, and that he would expect the matter settled by Michaelmas. Ellie stood in the rose-scented dark, with her back against the cold stone of Ravenswood, and understood that she was listening to a crime, not a crime the law had a comfortable name for. Harrington was far too able for that, but a crime nonetheless. The slow, patient devouring of a man through a debt that the devourer himself, she had not the smallest doubt, had built. Blackmail, plain blackmail, dressed in a dinner coat, and if he did it here, to Sir John Crewe, openly enough that a woman in the dark could overhear it, then he had done it before, and often, and well, and Ellie's whole skin went cold with the knowledge of what that meant. But she did not yet have the last piece, the piece that joined the smiling man to her own father, and she got it, as we so often get the worst news, gently and by accident, and from a kind old woman who meant no harm at all. It was the Dowager who gave it to her. The very next afternoon, the Dowager Duchess summoned Ellie to sit with her. The old woman did this now and then, frank and unsettling interviews that Ellie was never sure she had passed. And, somewhere in the talk, the Dowager, reminiscing in the way the old will reminisce, spoke of London seasons long past, and of the Viscount Beaumont, that she had known as a young man. Your father? The Dowager's pale eyes had softened, just slightly. I knew him a little, child, in his good years. A charming man. Too charming, perhaps. Charm and a card table are an unhappy pairing, but warm, genuinely warm, which is rarer than the world allows. I was sorry for his troubles. I was sorrier still for the company he kept at the end of them. She tapped her cane, once, absently. He had fallen in, those last years, with a particular set. Gaming men. I never cared for the chief of them. A smooth, hard creature, forever at your poor father's side. Forever so very obliging with a loan. And I see by your face that you are about to ask me his name, and I find I would rather not soil my drawing-room with it. So I shall only say that he is a viscount now, and that he wears a great deal of midnight blue, and that he is, I am given to understand, at present a guest beneath this very roof. There, I have said too much. Pour the tea. Ellie poured the tea. She told me, afterward, that she had no memory, whatever, of pouring it, that she came back to herself with the pot in her hand, and the dowager watching her with those sharp old eyes, and that the only thing in the whole of her mind was a single line in her father's unsteady hand. A smiling man, a friend, so very obliging with a loan. It was Harrington. It had been Harrington from the beginning, the friend at her father's elbow, the patient builder of the debt, the hunter. It was the man who had sent 24 roses to the narrow house, the man who had built her cage bar by Smiling Bar, the man she had heard the night before skinning Sir John Crewe alive in the estate room. Harrington had hunted her father into his grave. And now? And Ellie set down the teapot very carefully, because her hands had begun to shake. And now Harrington was courting his quarry's daughter, surrounding her, hurrying her toward a marriage. And Ellie understood at last, with a horror that went all the way to the floor of her, that whatever Viscount Harrington wanted from the house of Beaumont, he had not finished wanting it when her father died. The hunt is not, even now, concluded. She knew now who the hunter was. What she did not know, what she would spend the rest of this story learning. At a price I would spare her, if the telling of true stories allowed us to spare anyone, was why a wealthy viscount had spent years and patience and craft to destroy one not very important gambling viscount and his quiet family. What Harrington was truly reaching for, and what? For she had heard it under the cedar, in his flat pale stare. She had felt it in the way his eyes moved whenever the Duke's name was spoken. What the smiling man's long patient hunt had to do with the grave grey master of Ravenswood himself. She had to tell him. That was the thought that turned, all through that long sleepless night, that whatever she had decided about her own heart, whatever good sense had built between herself and the Duke of Ravenswood, this was larger than her heart now. She had heard a crime, she had a name, and tangled all through the matter, in a way she could feel but not yet see, was the Duke himself. She had to tell him what she had learned. And so Ellie did the thing she had spent 2 careful weeks not doing. She went looking, late, when the house had gone quiet, for Alexander. She found him where the roses were thickest. She found him in the orangery. I have saved the orangery, and I have saved the story of the roses, for this hour of the night, because they belong together. The orangery at Ravenswood was a long high house of glass at the end of the south terrace, and it did not, despite its name, hold oranges. It held roses. It held the rarest and most tender of all the roses of Ravenswood, the ones too delicate for the English winter, kept here under glass through the cold months, and brought to a strange and lovely flowering. And it had been built, Ellie now learned, for a reason. The Duke told her the reason that night, and I will tell it to you, because it is the heart of why this story is called what it is called. The roses of Ravenswood had been planted, everyone, by Alexander's mother, the late Duchess, dead these 12 years, and the one who had loved them after her, the one who had truly tended them, who had known every variety by name, who had built this glass house with his own allowance, to keep the tenderest of them alive, had been Alexander's younger brother, Lord Frederick, Freddie, the bright one, the laughing one, the warm, uncomplicated boy to Alexander's grave, ducaling gravity. And Lord Frederick had gone to the war alongside his brother, because Freddie would follow Alexander anywhere. and Lord Frederick had not come home. Ellie came into the orangery, and the warm green dark of it was drowned in the scent of roses, and the Duke of Ravenswood was standing among them, with a branch of candles set down on the staging beside him, looking at a white rose, as though it had asked him a question he could not answer. And when he turned and saw her, saw who it was in the doorway in the rose dark, every defence he had rebuilt over the careful fortnight simply was not there. "You have been avoiding me," he said, "and I have not been able to find the wrong I did, and it has been—" He stopped and started again with the bleak honesty that was the truest thing in him. "It has been very bad, Eleanor. I had forgotten it could be this bad. I had arranged my whole life so that it could never be this bad again." And Ellie, who had come to speak of Harrington, who had a name and a crime burning in her, who had every good and sensible intention, Ellie looked at the grief plain on his scarred face among his dead brother's roses, and found that the careful speech she had built went entirely out of her head. "You did no wrong," she said. "Hear me, you did no wrong. It was not anything you did. It was something I overheard. Two of your maids over the brass, saying the thing the whole world has already settled, that a duke whom the war has whispered of must have a duchess whom nothing has ever whispered of, and that I, with my father and my debts and my cracked name, that I am the last woman in England your grandmother could allow, and that to let you go on, caring, was only to do you harm. And they were right, Alexander. That is the unbearable part. They were not unkind, and they were not wrong, and so I did the only thing I could think of. I tried to be sensible. I tried to spare us both the stop. It was the same word she had once given him, in a shabby parlour, and it stopped her the same way. He had come closer. The candlelight moved on the scar. "Tell me what the war is whispered to have done. You said it. Say the rest. I would rather you heard it from me, here among these flowers, than ever again from a maid over the brass." And so, in the warm rose dark of his dead brother's glass house, the Duke of Ravenswood unlocked, for the first time in his life, and for one person only, the room he had kept shut since Waterloo. He told her about the boy of 19, the laughing young officer who had trusted him, whom he had not been able to reach across 40 yards of smoke and fire, whom he had watched fall. And then he told her the rest, the part the boy of 19 had only been the gateway to. He told her that he had had a brother, that Freddie had followed him to the war, as Freddie had followed him to everything, bright and certain, and 22 years old, that on the field at Waterloo the brothers had been separated in the chaos and the smoke, and that when at last the smoke cleared, Lord Frederick of Ravenswood was simply gone. Not among the living, not in any way the army could ever afterward confirm, among the named dead, gone, and that Alexander had come home alone to a grandmother who had lost, in one afternoon, the last of her younger blood, and to a great house full of a dead boy's roses, and to whisper. For there was a whisper, and it had not begun by itself. Someone had set it walking through the clubs and the drawing-rooms, while Alexander was still too sunk in grief to hear it. The whisper that the grave Duke of Ravenswood had not been the hero of the dispatches at all, that in the smoke of that terrible field he had, to save himself, somehow failed his own brother, that the missing Lord Frederick was a stain the family was at great pains to wash white. It was a lie, Alexander told her. It was a lie in a voice gone low and terrible, and Ellie believed him before he had finished the sentence, because she had heard the truth in him for 6 weeks, and could not now mistake it. It was a lie, but it was a lie with a master's hand behind it, placed with great skill, watered and tended and kept alive these 4 years by someone who wanted the house of Ravenswood shadowed. "And do you know," said the Duke of Ravenswood, very quietly, among the roses, "I have never been able to prove whose hand. I have my certainty. I have had it a long time. But certainty is not proof, and the man is clever and careful and forever smiling, and he goes, God help me, Eleanor. He goes everywhere I go. Harrington. Ellie's voice was a thread. It is Harrington. Alexander. That is why I came to find you tonight. That is what I came to say. Before your roses made me forget every sensible word of it. I have learned things. I have learned what he is. And there, in the orangery, the two halves of the story met at last. His and hers, the war and the card table, the shadowed brother and the hunted father. And they stood, very close, among the white roses and the candlelight, and they told each other the truth, all of it, the whole tangled shape of the smiling man, who had been moving through both their lives like a draft through a house. And as they spoke, the distance Ellie had so carefully built was simply gone, burned clean away. Because you cannot hold a man at a polite arm's length while you are saving each other's lives. And when the telling was done, they found that they were standing closer than the telling had required, and that neither of them had any wish on this earth to step back. They are right, you know, Ellie whispered. The maids, your grandmother, I am still the wrong bride. Nothing I have learned tonight has changed one word of that. I have decided, said the Duke of Ravenswood, that I no longer care to be governed by what is right in the eyes of a world I have just heard you twice now described to my face as a rotten machine. His hand had come up. His fingers were against her jaw, against the place where the freckles were. He was so close that the candlelight gave her only his eyes. I have lost a brother to the dark Eleanor, and 4 years of my life, and very nearly my whole heart, and I find I have no intention of also losing the one person who ever walked into me out of it. Tell me to step back. Tell me plainly, and I will never trouble you again. But do not tell me it is sensible, because I have had a great sufficiency of sensible, and so, I think, have you. And Ellie did not tell him to step back. She lifted her face in the rose dark, in the warm hush of his lost brother's glass house, and the Duke of Ravenswood bent his head, and they were a breath apart. A single breath, no more. The whole long, slow-burning summer narrowed down to 1/2 inch of candlelit air. When the orangery door flew open with a bang, and Margaret Beaumont half fell through it, breathless, bright-eyed, her hair coming loose and her cheeks flushed rose, with Lord Sebastian Vale a startled pace behind her, and the moment, the 1/2 inch, the whole fragile summer-built world of it, shattered like the glass it had been standing in. Ellie, cried Margaret, too full of her own news to read the room she had just broken. And that blindness was pure, Margaret, and Ellie loved her and could have wept. Ellie, there you are. I have looked everywhere. Oh, you will never guess. You will never in your life. And then Margaret did, at last, see her sister's face, and the Duke's, and the 1/2 inch, and the candlelight, and the white roses. And even Margaret, even radiant, heedless 19-year-old Margaret, went still and pink and said, in a much smaller voice, "Oh!" The Duke of Ravenswood stepped back, slowly. His eyes did not leave Ellie's. "Lady Margaret," he said with a courtesy that was almost steady. "Vale, you are most welcome. We were speaking of roses." But the breath was gone, and the 1/2 inch was gone. And you cannot, in this world, ever quite step back into a moment once a door has banged it open. Ellie knew it. The Duke knew it. And as the 4 of them stood among the white roses in the wreck of what had so nearly been, Margaret flushed with her interrupted news of Sebastian. Sebastian's charming face, for once wiped clean of charm. None of them yet knew the worst of it. None of them had seen the figure that had been standing in the dark of the terrace beyond the orangery glass. None of them knew that the smiling man, walking off the night air among the roses, had paused outside that long-lit house of glass, and looked in, and seen everything. The house party at Ravenswood broke up, as all house parties must, and the breaking of it was the breaking of the summer. In the few days that remained, Ellie and the Duke could find no orangery again. The world had closed back over them. There were always eyes now, always a room with someone in it. And they were left to speak with their faces across crowded drawing rooms, which, I will grant them, they had both become very skilled at. A look could carry a great deal. A look, across the dowager's dinner table, could say, "I have not stepped back. I am only waiting." And Ellie's look could answer, "I know. I am afraid. But I know." It was not enough. It was a very long way from enough. But it was what the world allowed them, and they spent it carefully, like the last coins in a purse. The Dowager Duchess watched them do it. The Dowager Duchess, I want you to understand, had by now worked out a very great deal. The old woman had not spent 50 years at the summit of that world without learning to read a silence. And on the last morning she summoned Ellie one final time. And what passed between them was brief, and Ellie carried it with her for the rest of her life. "You believe," said the Dowager, without preamble, "that I want a spotless bride for my grandson, and that you are not she. Someone has told you so. A servant, I expect. It has the flavour of the servants' hall." Her pale eyes held Ellie's. "Hear me, child, for I shall not say it twice, and I am too old to say things I do not mean. Have spent 3 years not hunting a spotless bride. I have spent 3 years watching my grandson turn slowly into stone, and praying to a God I am not at all sure attends to duchesses, for any living soul with the strength to reach him before the stone closed over. I had given up. And then he came home from a shabby parlour with a thought struck into him, and I filled my house with people to find out who had done it." She set one old hand, briefly, hard, over Ellie's. "I do not want a bride without a whisper, Eleanor Beaumont. I want a granddaughter who can make him laugh, and tell him the truth, and stand up in the wreck of things, and not break. Whether the world's whispers can be managed is the world's concern and mine, and I have managed harder. Do not you dare decide, in your pride, and you have a very great deal of it. I have watched it all summer. Do not you dare decide that you are sparing him by going away. That is not nobility. That is only fear, wearing nobility's coat. Now, your carriage is at the door. Go home and be brave about the right thing for once, instead of the wrong one." It was the kindest thing anyone said to Ellie that whole summer, and it was delivered like a blow, and Ellie went down the great steps of Ravenswood with her eyes stinging, and the old woman's words lodged in her like a splinter of light. But the summer had one last price to charge her, and it was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Viscount Harrington handed her into the carriage himself. He did it beautifully, of course. He did everything beautifully. And as Ellie's hand was, for one unavoidable moment, in his, he leaned in and he spoke to her low and pleasant, and for her alone, and the smile never once left his face. "What a charming summer it has been," said Harrington. "I do hope, Lady Eleanor, that you enjoyed the orangery. The roses there are quite famous. One hears that they flower most beautifully. But then one hears so very many things, in a house this size, if one only troubles to stand near the right windows." His pale eyes held hers, and they were not smiling, whatever his mouth was doing. "I am a patient man. I have been patient with your family, I think you will own, for a very long time. But I find my patience has lately acquired a rival in my regard for you, and a man cannot serve two such masters forever. We shall be in London together for the autumn. I shall call upon your mother. I think you understand me. I think you have always understood me, rather better than you have let me see. Clever girl. And one thing more, since we are being frank, you and I, at last." The smile deepened, the eyes stayed flat. "The Duke of Ravenswood and I are very old acquaintances, older than you could possibly guess. I should be desolated, truly desolated, to see his grace come to any fresh grief. He has had so much already. And he is, for all his grandeur, so very reachable. Do think on it on your long drive. Safe journey, Lady Eleanor." He stepped back. He bowed. The carriage pulled away down the mile of oaks, and Margaret chattered, and the Viscountess dozed, And Charlotte watched Ellie's white, set face and wisely said nothing. And Ellie sat very still with her father's letter sewn against her heart and understood, at last and completely, the full shape of the trap she stood in. She loved Alexander. She could no longer pretend to herself that she did not. The orangery had ended the pretending. The dowager, astonishingly, mercifully, would not stand against her. The one wall she had truly feared had just been quietly taken down by the very woman she had thought built it. But it did not matter. That was the cold truth she carried home down the mile of summer oaks. It did not matter that the dowager would allow it, because Harrington would not. And Harrington held her family's survival in one hand, and, by his own smiling account, some unguessed power over Alexander himself in the other. To turn from Harrington toward the Duke was no longer only to risk her own ruin. It was, if she had understood the man at the carriage door, to put the life of the man she loved into the hands of his oldest and most patient enemy. The summer had given Ellie Beaumont a great deal. It had given her the orangery, and the cedar, and a mind that answered her own, and an old woman's hard blessing. And it had given her, in the same breath, the knowledge that she might not be allowed to keep a single piece of it. And there, my dear listeners, the second part of our tale must rest. With a carriage rolling home through the green country, and a half-inch of candlelit air that was not, in the end, allowed to close, and a clever frightened woman carrying a summer's worth of love and a summer's worth of dread, in equal and unbearable measure, back toward the city. In the part that follows, the leaves will turn, and London will fill again for the autumn season, and the season this year will have poison in its wine. Harrington will keep his promise. He will call upon the Viscountess, and he will begin, quietly and beautifully, to spread a rumour that could finish Lady Eleanor Beaumont entirely. There will come into Ellie's hands a packet of letters written in coded French, and the secret bluestocking, the patient translator of poetry, will find at last the true and dangerous use of her gift, for what those letters conceal will reach back to a battlefield and forward to a treason, and will turn upon a question this story has not yet dared to ask aloud. What truly became, in the smoke of Waterloo, of Lord Frederick of Ravenswood? A brother the world believes dead, a name the femme does speak. And a shadow, you will recall, has been moving behind these roses since the very first. There will be a ballroom, and a moment when Ellie must choose, before all the watching tongue, between her own safety and the truth. And there will be a declaration, spoken at last without a single wall, left standing between them. And then, hard upon its heels, a parting that will cost them both more than anything this story has yet asked. The rose, you were promised, would tell you why this tale is named for it. In the part to come, you will learn at last what grew in its shadow, and whose hand it was that planted the thorns. Stay close. The fire is still warm, but the autumn is coming, and the autumn has teeth.